What if I told you that the nuclear family-like, the husband, the wife,
Yeah.
2.5 kids, the dog, the white picket fence, what if I told you that none of that is actually natural?
I mean, it completely shatters this really deeply comforting illusion we have about our modern lives.
Right.
We look at things like the family unit or, private property or even the government, and we just assume they're the absolute bedrock of human biology. Like, it's just always been this way since the dawn of time.
Yeah, that's the default setting for most of us, right?
Yeah.
You pour the concrete, it sets, and you build society right on top of it.
Exactly.
But then, and this is what we're getting into today, you step into the world of early human anthropology and ancient history, and suddenly you realize the concrete foundation is entirely synthetic. It's totally made up.
It's the absolute definition of paradigm shifting. When you actually look at the raw data of how early humans lived, the biological assumptions we make they completely fall apart. The rules we live by today are definitely not the only rules that could possibly exist.
And that brings us to our mission for this deep dive. We want to welcome you, you listening right now, to a journey that's going to ask a massive, honestly deeply provocative question. Are our most fundamental modern institutions actually hardwired into our human biology? Or, and this is the wild part, are they historical accidents that emerged out of very specific economic conditions? Meaning, they could easily have been entirely different.
Yeah, and to tackle a question of that magnitude, we have an incredibly dense, fascinating stack of sources today. We are pulling from the massive 50-volume Marx and Engels collected works.
Which is quite the stack of books.
It is. And I mean, that title alone carries a lot of historical and political weight. But we are looking at a very specific thread within those 50 volumes.
Right. We are entirely bypassing the political manifestos today.
Completely.
We're zooming in specifically on their deep historical and anthropological studies of pre-capitalist societies. We want to look at the raw data they analyzed to figure out where human institutions actually came from.
Yeah. And to do that, they relied really heavily on the 19th century anthropological fieldwork of an American scholar named Lewis H. Morgan.
Morgan is like the crucial linchpin here.
He really is. I mean, he wasn't a political theorist. He was a pioneering anthropologist. He actually went and lived among the Iroquois in North America and basically dedicated his entire life to studying indigenous kinship systems.
Wow.
Yeah, his fieldwork provided the empirical data that later theorists used to argue that capitalist institutions are they're not biologically innate.
So a quick but, very important disclaimer for you listening.
Okay.
Because this source material obviously involves foundational Marxist texts and politically charged theories regarding capitalism and communism, our mission today is strictly analytical.
Right.
We are not taking sides here. We are not endorsing any political ideology, left or right. We are simply acting as your impartial guides to unpack the historical and anthropological arguments made by the authors in these original texts.
It's really an exercise in intellectual history. We're putting these theories under the microscope to see how they reconstruct the literal dawn of human civilization.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our journey today is going to travel way back to primitive communal societies. We're going to trace how a single, seemingly harmless catalyst completely transformed the human family structure, essentially invented the concept of private property out of thin air, and ultimately required the invention of the state.
And to start that journey, we have to completely erase that cartoon image of a prehistoric caveman. The guy living in a neat little isolated cave with his cave wife and cave children.
Right, the Flintstones model of history.
Exactly. According to the anthropological evidence in our sources, that isolated family unit is a complete myth.
Because the Victorian assumption, back when a lot of this was being debated, was that monogamy was just the eternal human default. You found a mate, you defended your cave, and you started a family tree. But Morgan's groundbreaking book, Ancient Society, which our sources draw on heavily, demonstrates that early human social structures were vastly, unimaginably different. Human history did not begin with a nuclear family.
Not even close. And what's fascinating here is how Morgan actually discovered this. He didn't just study the Iroquois. He sent out incredibly detailed questionnaires to missionaries and government officials across the globe.
Like a massive survey.
Yeah, he was trying to map out how different indigenous tribes related to one another. He was looking for linguistic patterns and how people addressed their relatives.
Yeah.
And what he discovered in places like Hawaii fundamentally disrupted everything the Western world thought it knew about the family.
The Hawaiian kinship system. The text calls it the Punaluan family.
Yes.
But I was reading the notes on this. I had to read the paragraph 3 times to make sure I was understanding it correctly. Because the very words for mother and father meant something completely different than what we think.
Right, the Punaluen family is a system Morgan found evidence of in Hawaii and other Polynesian islands. And in this system, single, isolated couples simply did not exist. Instead, you had a highly structured form of group marriage.
Which sounds wild to us today.
It does. Now, the natural modern assumption is that group marriage means, random, chaotic, free love. But it wasn't chaotic at all. It was governed by incredibly strict, complex rules. The primary rule being that brothers and sisters were strictly prohibited from marrying one another.
Which tracks with our modern understanding of, preventing incest for genetic health. But who did they marry then, if not couples?
Well, a group of brothers would share a group of wives in common.
Okay.
And these wives were not their sisters, but they were often sisters to each other. Conversely, a group of sisters would share a group of husbands in common. The marriage wasn't between two individuals, it was a mutual contract between two entire groups.
My modern brain immediately starts short-circuiting when I try to picture the logistics of that.
Yeah.
I mean, the wildest part is how they define their children. If you have a group of brothers married to a group of sisters, who is the father of which child?
Under the Hawaiian system, that question is entirely irrelevant.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All the children of those brothers were legally and socially considered the brothers' mutual children. So if you were a man in this society, your biological brother's children were not your nieces and nephews. They were your literal sons and daughters.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, every one of a man's near and distant cousins was considered his brother.
So the concept of the individual, isolated family unit just did not exist. The family was this massive communal network. Your family was essentially your entire generation within the tribe.
Exactly. The individual ego was totally submerged into the collective. You didn't have one father and one mother. You had a dozen fathers and a dozen mothers, all of whom were equally responsible for your survival and upbringing.
I read that and started thinking about the utility of it. Like, if the nuclear family isn't a biological default, it must be more like a social technology, right? A tool we invented much later to solve a specific problem. Because if you look at the Iroquois in North America, they had an entirely different social technology, but it was equally functional.
Yeah, the Iroquois operated on a system based around the gens, which is essentially a massive kinship group or a clan claiming descent from a common ancestor. And the most defining feature of the Iroquois gens, and really most primitive societies at this stage of human development, was mother right, or matrilineal descent.
Matrilineal descent, meaning lineage is traced exclusively, 100% through the female line.
Yes, and the texts are very clear that this wasn't because of some abstract philosophical belief in female superiority or, a mystical reverence for motherhood. It was driven by simple, unarguable biology and the logistical reality of early human relationships.
Because of the group marriages.
Exactly. In a society where group marriage was the norm, or even in later stages where temporary pairing marriages easily dissolved, it was absolutely impossible to prove paternity. You just never knew for certain who the biological father of a child was.
Obviously, there were no DNA tests back then. If a woman has multiple husbands or partners change fluidly, the biological father is a total mystery.
But you always, undeniably, knew who the mother was.
Right?
The physical act of childbirth made the maternal line the only objective truth in the community. Therefore, the only reliable empirical way to trace a bloodline, to figure out who belonged to which clan, was through the mothers. This meant that the children belonged exclusively to the mother's gens, her clan.
Which creates a fascinating power dynamic, doesn't it? This gave women a fundamentally different status in society than they had in the centuries that followed. If the children belonged to the woman's clan, she's like the anchor of the entire community.
The text paints a really vivid picture of this. Because of mother right, households were deeply communal. You would have these large longhouses where several generations of women from the same gens lived together with their various husbands.
Okay.
And because the longhouse belonged to the women's clan, the women held a highly respected, free, and influential position. They controlled the communal household.
So if a husband was being lazy, or if the marriage just wasn't working out, she could literally just kick him out of the longhouse because he belonged to a different clan. He was essentially a guest in her family's home.
That is exactly how it worked. The myth that early woman was just the enslaved property of early man, dragged around by her hair, it's aggressively debunked by the authors. In these early communistic households, women were the undeniable center of gravity. They made the economic decisions for the household, and they held immense political sway within the tribe.
Wait, I have to pause here. That all sounds very egalitarian and logical for early humans.
Right.
But what about the animal kingdom?
What do you mean?
Like, if you watch any nature documentary about primates, you see strict male dominance. Look at gorillas. You have the silverback. He dominates a group of females, he fights off other males, and he aggressively protects his specific offspring. Isn't that a patriarchal, nuclear-ish family right there in nature? Why wouldn't early humans, who just evolved from apes, just do that? Doesn't the gorilla prove there is a biological baseline for male dominance and strict mating pairs?
That is the exact counter-argument many Victorian scientists made. But our sources explicitly reject using monkeys, specifically gorillas or chimpanzees, as a baseline for early human social organization.
Really? Why? If we share a common ancestor, why wouldn't we share a social structure?
Because of the specific, brutal, evolutionary hurdle that early humans had to clear just to survive. The text argues that man was a relatively weak, slow, unarmed animal just emerging from the animal kingdom. We didn't have claws, thick hides, or massive
We're
fang.
pretty defenseless.
Right. A single, isolated, early human family, like a silverback gorilla and his mates, would have been effortlessly wiped out by Ice Age predators or harsh environmental conditions. For humans to survive, they absolutely required the horde.
The horde, meaning like a large united group acting with joint effort.
A critical mass of cooperation. But here is the brilliant psychological insight from the sources. You cannot maintain a cohesive, cooperative horde if the adult males are constantly fighting each other out of sexual jealousy.
Well, that makes sense.
The intense jealousy of the dominant male, which you see in gorilla troops, actually splinters the group. When young male gorillas come of age, the silverback drives them out. It limits the size of the community to a single male sphere of dominance.
So jealousy is literally an evolutionary bottleneck. If we act like gorillas, our group stays small and we get eaten by saber-toothed tigers.
Exactly. To form the large, enduring hordes necessary for human survival, early man had to suppress that animalistic jealousy. Mutual toleration among the adult males and a complete absence of sexual jealousy were the absolute prerequisites for forming a society large enough to survive.
That is incredible. So to survive, we literally had to evolve past the jealousy of the silverback gorilla. Group marriage wasn't just some cultural quirk or a prehistoric summer of love. It was a hardwired evolutionary survival mechanism. It allowed large groups of men to hunt together and defend the tribe without killing each other over mates.
Yeah, the communal family, group marriage, mother, right? These were highly functional social technologies perfectly adapted to the economic reality of foraging and early survival. The system worked flawlessly for tens of thousands of years.
Okay, so if the system worked perfectly, if it was egalitarian, and if women held this highly respected central role, how did it all fall apart? I'm looking around at modern history and I see strict patriarchal nuclear families everywhere. Why on earth did we change the blueprint?
The shift wasn't driven by a sudden change in human psychology. It wasn't that humans magically discovered modern morality or romantic love. The engine of this massive social revolution was a seemingly simple economic and technological shift.
A technological shift dismantled the matrilineal longhouse. What was it?
The domestication of animals and the creation of a surplus. We are moving from the historical stage the authors call savagery, which is defined by hunting and gathering, living hand-to-mouth, into barbarism, which is defined by agriculture and pastoral herds.
Let's trace the mechanics of this, because this seems to be the pivot point for all of human history according to these texts. How does taming a sheep destroy a matriarchy?
It is the hinge upon which everything turns. For millennia, tribes survived on what they could forage or hunt. If you killed a mammoth, you ate it, but you couldn't hoard it for years. Wealth, in any meaningful sense, did not exist.
Right, you can't put mammoth meat in a bank account.
Exactly. But once pastoral tribes in places like the Fertile Crescent learned to domesticate animals, cattle, sheep, goats, horses, they suddenly had something unprecedented, a reliable, growing surplus of food and resources.
Because a herd of cattle isn't just today's dinner, it's tomorrow's dinner. It provides milk continuously. It provides hides for clothing and tents.
And most importantly, it reproduces itself. It is a self-replicating engine of wealth. For the first time in history, human beings were accumulating substantial generational wealth. And this new wealth acted like a virus within the old communal system.
Because the old system wasn't designed to handle surpluses.
Precisely. And the friction point stems from the early natural division of labor within the family. Under the old communal system, tasks were divided largely by sex. The women managed the communal household, prepared the food, and made the clothing. The men were responsible for procuring the food from the outside, hunting, fishing, fighting off threats, and making the weapons and tools necessary for those tasks.
Which makes total sense as a basic survival strategy in a harsh environment.
Right. And under the customs of the time, whoever made the tools and procured the resources was the undisputed owner of them. The woman owned the household goods, the man owned his weapons and hunting gear. So, when tribes began to capture and tame wild animals, who was doing the taming?
The hunters.
The men.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Because the men were the ones operating outside the household, they naturally became the managers, and therefore the owners, of these new, massively valuable herds. Suddenly, men were acquiring unimaginable wealth compared to previous generations. They had hundreds of cattle, and later they had slaves captured in intertribal warfare to help tend those massive herds.
Okay, I'm trying to picture what happens next. We have a man. He has spent his life building a massive herd of cattle. He has unprecedented wealth. But we're still operating under the old social technology. Mother right, matrilineal descent.
This creates an insoluble conflict. The man has all this new wealth, but under mother right, he does not belong to the same gens, the same clan as his own children. His children belong to his wife's clan.
Right, because lineage is only traced through the mothers. So when this wealthy patriarch is on his deathbed, looking at his massive herd of cattle, who gets the cows?
According to the ironclad, ancient rules of the gens, property had to stay within the clan. It could not cross over into a different gens. So a man's wealth would pass to his nearest clan relatives, his biological brothers, his sisters, or his sister's children.
His sister's kids get the herd.
Yes. And his own biological children are completely disinherited from his wealth because they belong to their mother's clan, not his.
Man, that is a recipe for a massive family feud. You spend your whole life building up this empire of cattle. You look at your own sons, and you know they aren't going to get a single sheep. I could see the friction building. Men are accumulating all the economic power, but the legal framework of society strips them of the ability to pass that power to their direct descendants.
It was an untenable contradiction. As wealth increased, it gave the man a much more important status in the family than the woman. He was the one bringing in the massive surplus that the whole tribe relied on. And this immense economic leverage created a powerful, undeniable stimulus to overthrow the old rules of inheritance.
Because the men wanted their wealth to pass to their direct descendants.
Exactly. And so the solution was the historical overthrow of mother right.
How did they actually overthrow it, though? Did they just wake up one day and vote on it?
The texts suggest it was a profound, likely coercive revolution, though it may have happened gradually over generations. The men used their newfound economic dominance to change the customary laws. They decreed that henceforth, descent would be traced through the male line and children would remain in the father's gens.
The texts frame this as a massive, tragic turning point, don't they?
Friedrich Engels famously calls it the world historical defeat of the female sex. The overthrow of mother right completely dismantled the old social order. Women were stripped of their central role in the communal household.
That's heartbreaking.
It was a total reversal. The large, egalitarian, matriarchal longhouses were broken up into isolated, single-family units. The man took absolute command of the new home, and the woman was reduced to a status of dependency. She essentially became an instrument for producing heirs.
To produce heirs who could inherit the cattle? Which completely reframes the origin of strict monogamy. We are culturally conditioned to think of monogamy as this beautiful romantic ideal, finding your soulmate, two hearts becoming one. But the dark origin presented in this anthropological data is that strict monogamy wasn't born out of romantic love at all. It was a cold economic calculation.
Entirely economic. Once inheritance switched to the father's line, the father absolutely needed to know with 100% biological certainty that the children his wife bore were his own. If he wasn't certain, he risked leaving his hard-earned wealth to another man's genetic offspring.
Hence, strict, unbreakable monogamy is enforced, but specifically for the woman.
Exactly. The text notes that this new patriarchal pairing family was characterized by the strict fidelity demanded of the woman under severe punishment. Meanwhile, infidelity remained a tacit or even legally explicit prerogative for the man. The entire structural purpose of the institution was to guarantee undisputed paternity. It had nothing to do with mutual affection.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When I was reading the notes on how the ancient Romans codified this new patriarchal family, the etymology of the words they used is just chilling. The word familia.
Oh, yes. The Roman familia does not originally mean what we think of as a cozy, loving family unit gathered around the hearth. The word is derived from the Oscan word famil, which literally means slave. And familia originally meant the totality of slaves belonging to one man.
The family literally meant the slaves.
Yes. The ancient patriarchal family was an economic and agricultural enterprise. It included the patriarch, his wife, his children, and a large number of slaves and serfs bound to agricultural service. And the law gave the male head of the household absolute power over everyone in that unit. Under early Roman law, the patriarch held the power of life and death over his slaves, his children, and his wife.
The power of life and death over his wife and kids.
Yep.
Because they were essentially categorized as part of his property portfolio.
What's fascinating here is how the authors view this shift in the grand scheme of human development. They argue that the patriarchal family represents the first major class antagonism in human history.
Really, the very first one.
Yes, the subjugation and oppression of the female sex by the male inside the home perfectly mirrors and sets the blueprint for the broader oppressions that are about to emerge in society at large. The family unit becomes a microcosm of societal class conflict.
So, to summarize where we are on this timeline, the invention of wealth, specifically the domestication of animals, fractured the ancient egalitarian communal family. It isolated people into competing patriarchal units, focused entirely on hoarding wealth for their specific heirs. But this wealth didn't just stay inside the family tent. It completely changed how humans interacted with the physical world and the neighboring tribes around them.
Which leads us directly into the birth of private property, commodity exchange, and the economy as we know it today.
Because moving from communal ownership, where the tribe shares the hunting grounds, the tools, and the longhouse, to private property wasn't just some overnight theft, right? It wasn't one aggressive guy putting a fence around a lush valley and saying mine. It was a slow evolution driven by what the text calls the division of labor.
The increasing division of labor is the invisible engine driving all of these societal changes. We already talked about the first great division of labor, the natural division between men and women, which led to the patriarchal family once wealth was introduced. But as society grew more complex and as populations expanded due to the reliable food supply, a second great division of labor occurred.
What was the catalyst for the second stage?
The separation of handicrafts from agriculture. As humans got better at manipulating their environment, inventing the loom for weaving, discovering how to smelt bronze, and eventually forge iron, it became physically impossible for one family to do everything. You couldn't tend a massive herd of cattle, grow acres of grain, weave all your own cloth, and forge your own iron tools simultaneously.
There literally aren't enough hours in the day. You needed specialists.
People began to specialize. One family focused entirely on blacksmithing, another focused entirely on farming. And once you specialize, a fundamental shift happens in why you make things.
How so?
Previously, if you spent 3 days making a pair of leather shoes, you made them so you should wear them. You produced for your own direct use or the direct use of your communal tribe. But now, the specialist blacksmith makes 100 iron axes. He doesn't need 100 axes. He can't use them.
Right, he's only got 2 hands.
Exactly. He makes them explicitly to exchange them for the things he does need, grain, cloth, or cattle.
It's producing commodities.
Production for exchange rather than production for direct use. This is the birth of commodity production. And to facilitate this complex web of exchange, society needed a universal equivalent, something everyone agreed had inherent value to act as a medium. Initially, as the text notes, cattle served as money. You bought an iron plow for 3 cows.
Oh, wow.
Eventually, as trade expanded, it shifted to precious metals, which were weighed out and later minted into standardized coins.
Okay, so we have families specializing, creating commodities, and trading them using money. Society is getting incredibly complex. But then the text introduces a third stage of the division of labor, and this one is specifically tied to the dawn of what the authors call civilization.
The third and most decisive division of labor. As trade routes lengthened and markets expanded, society created a class of people who do not produce anything at all. They don't grow grain, they don't forge iron, they don't weave cloth, they don't tend cattle. All they do is facilitate the exchange of the products made by others.
Oh, man.
This is the birth of the merchant class.
The ultimate middleman.
The texts are incredibly scathing in their analysis of the merchant class. They describe merchants as parasites and genuine social bloodsuckers.
I was reading this section, and I immediately thought of modern platform apps.
Ha! Like what?
You know, you have an independent software developer who spends 2 years writing the code for a brilliant mobile game. And you have a user who really wants to play that game. And then you have the App Store sitting right in the middle. The App Store didn't write a single line of code for the game, but it inserts itself as the mandatory marketplace. It owns the digital real estate. And because it controls the platform, it takes a mandatory 30% cut of every single transaction. The ancient merchant class is the original App Store.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The merchant provides the platform, the physical marketplace, the caravans, the ships, the protected trade routes. They take the risk and trouble of exchange off the producer's hands. The blacksmith doesn't have time to walk to the next village to sell his axes. The merchant does it for him.
But at a steep cost.
Right. In return for controlling that platform, they extract wealth from both the producer and the buyer. They skim the cream off the top of everyone's actual labor.
They buy cheap from the blacksmith and sell dear to the farmer.
And what the authors point out is that by doing this, the merchants rapidly consolidate immense wealth without ever lifting a hammer. And with that immense wealth comes enormous social influence. They begin to dictate what gets produced, when it gets produced, and who gets to buy it.
But let me push back here on the parasite label, because that feels heavily loaded. If I'm a farmer in a remote valley, I need the merchant to bring me the iron plow from the city. Doesn't the text acknowledge that exchange was a practical necessity? As populations grew, tribes inevitably met at their borders. You have a tribe with excess salt and a tribe with excess flint. Isn't trade just a natural, rational human behavior? And wasn't private property just an efficient way to manage that complex trade?
It's a vital point, and to be fair, the text completely acknowledges that exchange started naturally, particularly at the borders where different tribes met and had different natural resources. It wasn't born out of an evil conspiracy. It was a practical, logistical solution to resource distribution.
So why the harsh judgment from the authors? Why call them bloodsuckers?
Because of what that system of exchange ultimately did to the social fabric of humanity. As production shifted entirely from creating things for our tribe to use, to creating commodities to exchange for profit on the open market, the ancient communal bonds dissolved completely.
I see.
When you are producing for the market, you are no longer a community working together for mutual survival. You are an isolated individual competing against everyone else.
You're guarding your trade secrets.
Yeah.
You're trying to undercut your neighbor's prices. If your neighbor's crops fail, that's actually good for you because the price of your grain goes up.
Private property and commodity exchange take the cooperative tribe and shatter it into a collection of atomic individuals, each looking out purely for their own profit. And this system inevitably created profound structural inequality.
The rich and the poor.
Exactly. Within a few generations, you have extreme polarization. You have a few people who own massive estates, massive herds, and merchant fleets. And you have a huge population of people who own nothing but their own bodies, their own labor, which they have to sell to the rich just to survive.
You have creditors and debtors.
It's the birth of class society. Society was now fundamentally split into conflicting antagonistic groups. You had rich and poor, producers and merchants, freemen and slaves, men and women, the old tribal structures, the egalitarian gens where everyone was kin, where there were no police because conflicts were settled by community consensus, were totally incapable of managing a society built on extreme inequality.
Because the old system relied on mutual trust and shared survival. But if half the tribe owes the other half of the tribe crippling debts, that trust is gone.
The society becomes a powder keg. The old communal system had no mechanism to keep the peace in a society torn apart by class antagonisms. If you have extreme inequality, the poor are going to eventually realize they outnumber the rich and try to take the wealth back. The debtors will rise up against the creditors. The slaves will revolt against the masters.
Which means the society is constantly teetering on the edge of total collapse.
A new tool was desperately needed to prevent these conflicting classes from consuming themselves and completely destroying society in a never-ending civil war.
And that new tool is the state.
This brings us to the ultimate conclusion of the author's historical analysis: the inevitability of the state.
This is the part of the deep dive that really challenged my traditional civics class understanding of government. Because the way we are usually taught, the state, the government, the laws, the courts, the police, is this noble, eternal institution.
Right.
If you read philosophers like Hegel, whom our authors are directly critiquing in these texts, the state is presented as the reality of the ethical idea. It's framed as the ultimate expression of human reason coming together to create a just, orderly society for everyone.
The Hegelian view is incredibly pervasive. It's the idea that the state represents the mind of society, standing above petty individual interests to ensure justice and fairness for all citizens. But the authors of our sources look at the anthropological and historical record and say, no, that is a philosophical fiction.
Wow.
The state is not an eternal institution. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived perfectly well in massive tribes without a state, without a king, without police or prisons.
So if it's not the embodiment of an ethical idea, what is it? What is the actual architecture of the state according to this analysis?
The state is a specific, pragmatic tool born out of an insoluble contradiction. As we just discussed, society split into free men and slaves, rich and poor. The economic interests of these classes were in direct, irreconcilable opposition.
Right.
The slave wants to be free. The slave owner wants to exploit the slave's labor for profit. The debtor wants his debts forgiven. The creditor wants his money with interest.
They are locked in a zero-sum game. One side's victory is the other side's defeat.
And to prevent this zero-sum game from devolving into constant, bloody chaos that would destroy the entire economy, a power was needed that seemingly stood above society. A power to alleviate the conflict, mediate the disputes, and maintain order.
Okay, so far that sounds exactly like a neutral referee. The state steps onto the field to break up the fight, throw a penalty flag, and make sure everyone plays by the rules.
It appears to be a neutral referee. It presents itself as an impartial arbiter. But here is the critical pivot in their argument, the core thesis of their political theory. Because the state arose in the very midst of this class conflict, and because maintaining that order requires massive, tangible resources, taxes, armed forces, prisons, bureaucrats, the state naturally and inevitably fell into the hands of the most powerful, economically dominant class.
Because they're the only ones who can afford to fund the referee.
The referee is on the payroll of one of the teams. The economically dominant class, the people who own the land, the herds, the merchant fleets, uses the apparatus of the state to become the politically dominant class. They use the state to write the laws, command the police, and staff the courts, all to legally codify and protect their wealth.
So the state isn't there to protect the weak from the strong. The state is there to protect the property of the strong from the desperation of the weak.
That is exactly how the texts define it. The state is an instrument of class rule. The authors give deep historical examples to prove this. Look at the ancient states of Athens or Rome. These were not democracies for everyone. They were explicitly the state of the slave owners. The entire legal and military apparatus was designed to keep the massive, overwhelming population of slaves suppressed and working.
If the slaves tried to strike the Roman legions, the state would crush them.
Look at the feudal state of the Middle Ages. It was the organ of the nobility, designed with complex laws to keep the peasant serfs tied to the land, forcing them to pay tribute to the lords. And the modern representative state, they argue, despite its democratic trappings, is fundamentally an instrument for the owners of capital, the bourgeoisie, to manage and exploit wage labor, the proletariat. The laws are fundamentally written to protect private property and corporate interests above all else.
But history is incredibly messy. I'm trying to think of counterexamples. Has there ever been a time when the state actually did act independently, where the government wasn't just a puppet for the rich, but actually forced the rich to compromise?
The sources do point out some fascinating historical anomalies where the state seems to achieve independence. There are rare transitional periods where the warring classes are so perfectly evenly balanced that neither side can completely dominate the other.
Okay, so what happens then?
In those specific moments, the state authority temporarily gains an illusion of true independence because it can play both sides against each other to maintain its own power.
Like who? What's an example of that?
They cite Bonapartism in France, specifically the First and Second French empires under Napoleon Bonaparte and later his nephew, Louis Napoleon. In those moments, the rising bourgeoisie, the capitalists, and the proletariat, the working class, were locked in a stalemate. Neither could win outright. So Napoleon's state apparatus stepped in, promising order and stability to both sides, but essentially ruling autocratically above them both.
He became the ultimate referee because the two teams exhausted each other.
Another example they give is the Bismarck Empire in late 19th century Germany. The power of the rising industrial capitalists and the entrenched power of the old aristocratic Prussian landowners were perfectly balanced against each other. Otto von Bismarck, as the chancellor, used the state to play these two powerful elites off one another, making the government appear completely independent of both.
But even in those anomalies, The state is still just managing a conflict between elites, or managing a stalemate between classes. It is still fundamentally defined by and reacting to class conflict.
The independence is temporary and illusory. Eventually, the economic realities shift. One class gains the upper hand, and the state reverts to being their specific instrument.
So what does this all mean? I want to pose a question directly to you, the listener. Think about the modern state today. Think about our tax codes, our justice system, our lobbying infrastructure. Based on this historical analysis, you have to ask yourself a deeply uncomfortable question. Does the modern state actually serve as a neutral referee for the benefit of all citizens equally? Or, when push comes to shove, is its primary function to protect the property, the status, and the investments of whoever currently holds the most wealth?
It is the exact question these texts demand we ask. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it leads to the grand final thesis of the authors regarding the future of the state.
Right, because if the state isn't eternal, if it didn't exist for the first 90% of human history, and if it only has a beginning because of class conflict, then, logically, it can have an end.
The authors argue that because the state is purely a byproduct of class division, it is not a permanent fixture of human existence. Their grand prediction is that if society ever reorganizes production on a free and equal basis, if we eliminate the antagonistic classes of rich and poor, owners and exploited, and return to a modern form of communal ownership, then the state will lose its entire reason for existing.
Because there's no longer a class war that requires a heavily armed referee to suppress. If no one is hoarding the cattle, you don't need police to guard the fences.
Precisely. Without class antagonisms to hold in check, the state becomes completely obsolete. It simply withers away. Engels has a famous, highly evocative quote for this. He says that a truly free and equal society will take the whole machinery of the state and put it where it will then belong. Into the Museum of Antiquities by the side of the spinning wheel and the bronze axe.
Into the Museum of Antiquities, just another relic of a bygone era. We'll look at the concept of a government the same way we look at a flint arrowhead, as a primitive tool we simply outgrew once we learned a better way to live.
It's a breathtakingly radical vision of the future, but it is rooted entirely in their rigorous analysis of the deep prehistoric past.
Which brings us to the end of this incredible journey. Let's summarize what we've unpacked today. We've waded into the deep waters of the 50-volume Marx and Engels collected works, bypassing the political rhetoric to examine their use of Lewis H. Morgan's anthropological data.
We saw how the Hawaiian Prenelloan family and the Iroquois matrilineal gens shattered the Victorian idea that the nuclear patriarchal family is a biological default. For most of history, we lived in massive cooperative matrilineal networks to survive.
We traced how the invention of wealth, specifically the domestication of animals, created a surplus that motivated men to overthrow Mother Right. They wanted to pass their property to their own direct descendants, which inadvertently invented strict monogamy and the oppressive patriarchal household in the process.
We explored how the division of labor birthed private property, commodity exchange, and the merchant class, the original middlemen who dissolved communal bonds into isolated, competitive self-interest.
And finally, we saw how the extreme inequality generated by this new economy threatened to tear society apart in a civil war, necessitating the invention of the state. Not as a noble ethical ideal, but as an armed referee that ultimately serves the interests of the wealthy class.
The overarching lesson of all this data is that human institutions are entirely fluid. They are not biological. They are adaptations to specific material and economic conditions.
And that is exactly why you, the listener, should care about this deep dive. Because understanding that our most rigid, seemingly permanent institutions are actually historical constructs means recognizing a profound truth. Society is malleable. The rules we live by right now, the economic systems we stress over, the family structures we debate, the governments we elect, they're not the only rules that have ever existed, and they're certainly not the only rules that can exist.
If human beings invented the patriarchal family and the state to adapt to the rise of agriculture and pastoralism, we are entirely capable of inventing brand new structures to adapt to whatever comes next.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. We've seen how the family, private property, and the state only emerged because of past economic shifts, like taming sheep and inventing the iron plow. Well, look at the world today. We are living through an economic shift that completely dwarfs the agricultural revolution. We have the digital revolution. We have the rise of artificial intelligence, automated labor, and decentralized digital networks.
The material conditions of our lives, how we produce things and communicate, are changing faster than at any point in human history.
So if our economy is radically changing, what entirely new, unimaginable social institutions might be forming right now? If the state was invented to manage the conflicts of the Bronze and Iron Ages, what kind of institution is about to replace this state in the age of AI? Are we currently pouring the concrete for a totally new foundation without even realizing it?
It's a thrilling and somewhat terrifying question. But history tells us that change is the only true constant.
We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking closely at the foundation of the house you live in, and we will see you next time.